I have a great panel of people who have spoken already, so we're going to try not to say the things we've said before, but try to pull back a bit. So I've got Catherine, Emilio, Sanaz, and Rudy here. You've been introduced to them before, so I'm going to just start out with a question. I want to hear first, what surprised you in the last day and a half? One thing, more things. What was a surprise? Anybody?
Yeah, I can feel this. Three things surprised me.
Wow.
You were prepared.
I'm
You were
very
prepared.
surprised.
So only one of us has to speak now. We're good.
I'm gonna put my notebook away.
Yes.
3 things. Lots of people said who were researchers that they were finding the same pattern of racism or sexism, or they were finding the same effects that happened 20 years ago. I think we didn't make enough of that point.
Yes.
I found that surprising. I mean, I did and I didn't because I'm cynical, but it's worth re-mentioning. I was really surprised by the consistency with which people said they didn't like certain terms or words and how uncomfortable it made them. And then I thought, okay, we should really probably do research on that and understand better what we can do to mitigate that. Do we need to be introducing new words? Do we need to be clarifying definitions? What's happening there? Because we can't communicate about these issues if the words make us anxious. And then the third thing was how often I heard that this was a cultural problem. And then so everybody hinted at it. That's a big word, and I'm including things like unconscious bias, implicit bias, and stereotypes in the umbrella of culture, but we didn't have a lot of great ideas about, we all agree that we need to change it, and we're not quite sure how that's going to happen. I thought that was surprising.
Who wants to go next?
I don't know if I would find this surprising, but I think sort of a theme that was clarified for me earlier in the day was this idea that companies need to funnel the things that they value into D&I, and I think there are a couple of examples that came up. One was executive time, so chief diversity officers having a path to CEO. We're talking about employee time, so making, if people are doing this sort of non-promotional work of diversity, that should be included in their jobs.
It is promotional work.
What?
You said non-promotional work.
It should be promotional.
It should be yes, absolutely. Money for ERGs, tying diversity goals to compensation and performance evaluations, and then putting employee brain power, within tech companies like data science and analytics and design, and sort of funneling that back into D&I. And I think that's not only common sense and I think can be very effective, but I think it's also a strong cultural statement about what the companies really value.
So I think what surprised me was that, and I spend most of my time in a business school interacting with managers and with executives, teaching them and also doing research in real companies. But what surprised me is how I feel like there's still, for us academics, there is a lot to learn in what's happening inside organizations like yours, right? And I think I've been learning this from some of your presentations, but also the one-on-one interaction. And it's also surprising that you also know very little about what we are currently doing as researchers that could help you as well in terms of implementing and thinking about change in the workplace. So it was surprising for me to see this. And related to the second point, it was also very surprising, and this is a joke, right? It's like people were talking about like this research and that research, but you don't cite people. You don't cite the names of the people, and the same thing with companies. We talk about examples of companies, and you don't tell us that company. So things that are very clear, that are norms for us in our worlds, became very apparent when we were actually talking about the findings in academia and also the findings in companies. You know the companies, you talk about them, we know about the research, but we were not very explicit about some of these things.
That's true. Rudy.
If I can be real with everyone. We're talking about changes in culture and systems levels, places where we have to go. I'm surprised by the dearth of sponsors for this conference and the number of people who are here. We have a conference on something about artificial intelligence, and it's packed. And here we are.
Yep.
And I think that's a strong signal. And it's related to certainly things that I brought up earlier, and we're not voting with our feet and with our wallets as when it comes to companies that do have resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is for me one of the big takeaways from this. I organize a lot of conferences, and when they're on technical topics, we seem to get lots of sponsorship, and we fill this room easily. And this, which I think has been in the media and on everybody's minds for months now, and yet when push comes to shove, I mean, I actually have appreciated it because I love talking to groups of women. Usually, I'm in front of groups of men, and so this is it. But I'm going to say one thing that. Just one observation, not really a surprise. An observation is that we haven't talked much about other organizations. We've really talked about companies, the public sector. Are they doing better on this? I kind of doubt it. I can certainly say that universities are probably not doing as well, and that one of the things that we as researchers should probably be doing is also looking at our own institution, how we reproduce gendered and also sort of racially biased systems. Those of you who are in the audience who have been in tenure decision meetings or recruitment meetings, it's kind of scary how little we use all these things that people have been talking about for the last 2 days about systematic criteria that we all agree upon. That's something that, at least in my world, is not really done. So I think the universities have a long way to go. Okay, how about where do you think we should go with research and/or practice?
I have some thoughts.
Good.
It's sort of a response to what you were just saying. So, knowledge about thoughtful things we can do is not enough. So I think some of the research I would love to see is around these questions of implementation. Even if you have a good idea, how do you get people to do it? What are the forces pushing against that? I think, as Sana said, we talked a lot about cultural change and why that's important. So I'd love to see interventions around cultural change, which I'm excited to see coming out in the future by academics who may or may not be on this panel. And I think more intervention work in organizations. That was not a plug. Okay, more intervention work in organizations, I think, is really exciting.
Can I piggyback?
Of course.
Interventions that do and don't work.
Yes.
Both should come out.
Yes, please. When things fail, that's a lesson.
What do you mean come out?
I mean, like, as academics, our research, we tend to focus on some things that do work or the effects we do find. But for this audience and for these conversations, it's also important to be able to say, you don't need to do this. We're not finding that this is moving the needle that much. Don't put your time or resources into it. That's helpful information to communicate.
Right.
And we've been really bad about doing it. And I think it's part of what's keeping the gap so big between industry and academics.
Well, we academics do not get rewarded for proving the null hypothesis. Right?
Well, I'm not in a position to make changes to that system.
Yeah. No, but that's why I wanted you to be more explicit about this. Sure.
I've said it before. I think that research needs to address interpersonal issues and intrapsychic and socio-emotional issues to respond directly to the invitation. We also need reliable and open partners in this enterprise. And so, in my experience, there's been times where sort of like, we'll call you back Monday. And then you kind of find out that it's, the lawyers ended up saying no, or the non-disclosure agreements, or there's these barriers to at least the type of research that I think as academics we're used to conducting. My dream, as I say, would be that to collect data across multiple companies. Along which you can classify and categorize in terms of the dimensions of the company. Let's say from numerical diversity to climate to feelings of belonging to the representation within the CEOs, and then have those differ, and then look at differing outcomes at the level of companies. And I guess one of the other things that's surprising to me is just how much resistance there is to sharing and releasing data. I think it has something to do with trade secrets. Don't let those, evildoers have our secrets. But I think there's a larger purpose here.
And I agree with the what the three of you have said. So just not to be repetitive, maybe what I will add is one of the things that I heard from one of the members of the audience is, especially from my perspective as an academic, I think that spending some of my time teaching professionals and teaching executives about the importance of managing a diverse workforce is actually something that could be very helpful. And it was aligned with this idea of being inclusive. When I teach or when we teach some of these materials, what it means is also try to engage and convince the most skeptical people that sometimes are not necessarily just the white male, right? I mean, in situations where and there is research on this, that ironically sometimes groups of individuals in particular groups will be also opposed to certain changes. So I think that the learning that we can provide to think about this as a challenge that we're going to be facing in organizations managing a very diverse workforce is going to be really important for us.
Yeah, I think starting with the panel I moderated first thing yesterday, one of the panels, what was his name? Jose. I don't remember his name was, not Hector, the other. Jason was very eloquent about how he operates at a very much a personal, interpersonal level and building empathy. And I think if we really care about cultural change, there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the interpersonal level, because I don't think we're going to save it on Twitter. I think we're going to, and convincing, as you know, convincing people is very hard. I mean, it's a slow process, it takes time, building trust. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the ground floor within organizations for us to make the progress. The one thing that did surprise me, and then I'll let you answer, is I'm heartened by, I'm probably one of the oldest people in the room now, and there is a new generation. There's a generation of people who are very optimistic, who do not want to put up with the state of things. I mean, who either are shocked by it and really outraged by it, or at least recognize it and want to change it. That the world that was created, a world that I actually sort of spent a lot of time studying in my earlier work by a bunch of white dudes, is not the world that we want to see moving forward. It's not just, it is that it makes better investment decisions if you make the workforce more diverse, but it's also just morally and personally and ethically not a world that we want to leave on for our children and our grandchildren. So I'm sort of struck that we have an opening. And I'm going to try, like Sanaz, I'm going to try to resist going into the cynical mode, which says institutions and structures reproduce themselves, and rather say there are openings right now. There are interesting openings with millennials, with really great new diversity people. Some of these people have been speaking at the conference, investors, people who really care about changing. And it's, that's what the world does, change with people getting together and making things happen. So I'm most interested right now in how do we keep the conversation between industry and researchers going? It's not an easy one. As we said, as the organizers of this conference, we're thinking, should we even do this again? On the one hand, yeah, we've gotten a lot of feedback that says, this is great. And I've, personally learned an amazing amount. And yet, the people who organize it are going to say, or my colleagues are going to say, we didn't even fill the auditorium. So the question is, how can we move forward and make this something that expands and continues to grow? Rudy.
We raised our hands at the same time.
Oh. You can go first.
No, please.
I was just going to say that our conversation naturally drifted towards moments, I said this earlier around hiring and firing, but there's a lot of things that happen in work life in between. Like when you reflect on a work experience, you often don't reflect on the interview process or the exit process, but you have stories about what happened while you were there. And it's those moments that we don't have great behavioral data right now to measure. Some researchers are able to get it, but technology is exciting because there's a lot of new kinds of data that measures life in new ways, which we can be studying, but we haven't thus far. And it might give us some leverage on some of the questions that we've been asking today.
My sense is that there's a lot of focus. When we're talking about sort of making the industry better, or how to fix ourselves. It's a very intrapersonal approach where sort of like examine your implicit bias, right? Or mindfulness, right? And training, or awareness training. There's a very sort of personal focus on that, and and then you hear things like empathy and compassion, and you get the immediate like eye glaze and eye roll, or what are some of the microaggressions or the micro affirmations, right? And then people think, then you get dismissed at the level of that's not that doesn't really sort of affect the bottom line. We need social science, not just the computer science expertise in these arenas. I think I just want to say, that there's so much need for this type of conference. I mean, if we can bring one more person than you have and drag them to the end of the conference, all the way to the end, that doubles our capacity. And I'm making a very explicit pitch to people to get leadership involved, and also an explicit pitch for collaboration among organizations and companies themselves who are thinking about these issues. There's interventions to be done, and it's more than implicit bias.
Or pipelines.
Or
pathways maybe.
Or there's just so many different ways in which we can intervene.
Yeah. There's a lot of research to be done. So those of you who are students, you are welcome to join this. I want to open this conversation up so it doesn't just become us talking to you. So I want to just open up and ask,
Question.
Yeah.
So I work at a startup. We have about can everyone hear me? Yeah. I work at a startup.
I could still hear you.
I don't know how to turn this on. Anyway, I work at a startup. We have about 200 people. I'm like an individual contributor, right? I'm not on C-suite. I'm not, leading. I'm not part of the leadership team. We just started a diversity committee, which is why I'm here. We have like 6 people. We were like, hey, we want to kind of get this going. And they're like, oh, come to this conference.
So that's why I'm here. And I guess my question is so much of what I've learned so much while I've been here, but I don't know if I have a lot of practical things that I can necessarily take back and say, okay, guys, here's like 5, not steps to get us somewhere, but at least something to get us going, right? Because I can't go to our CEO and I could try, right? But I'd love to hear what you guys' ideas are on just someone from my position. What can I do?
So I'm gonna tell you one thing that I've learned in the past few days, and I think it's I'm gonna frame it as 3 worries that I have. Then it's gonna be like a solution and a proposal. There, okay? So I worry that some of you are coming to, or all of us are coming into things like this, thinking of best practices, right? There is the best solution. There is the best way of doing this. And just talking to each other and just presenting, we've learned that there is no such thing. I mean, at MIT, I will never ever teach a class where someone wants to learn the best practices. I tell them, go to the airport, grab one of those books, and then you try, right? But here's about serious research, right? So that's one of the worries that I have as the result of the conversations we've had here. A second worry is, especially because I work on topics that have to do with meritocracy and merit in the workplace, is that I don't think a solution to the problem will be getting rid of evaluative processes, right, of any sort, right? So when I hear organizations out there that they say, we're getting rid of performance evaluations, for example, right? Just because we know that performance evaluations are not working, they're biased, right? But just think about the alternative. It's like having now everybody in their head, the evaluation of all these different individuals, and at the end of the day, let me just use my stereotypes and all I have in my head in order to decide who's going to get promoted, right? And the same thing a little bit, it was in the panel before, right? A lot of these kind of conversations, and I could hear the professor of finance kind of struggling about this. You cannot get rid of all these ways of evaluating ideas at the time of funding, because if you start really destroying that, then what's gonna happen? I think that was the second worry. And then my third worry was.
I think this is number 4.
I think no. It's the.
We're not counting.
I'll be fast. I don't want to monopolize this. So my third worry, it's really my third worry, but anyways, is pushback. The unintended consequences of a lot of the things that you're trying to do. And I've seen that in the research I do, in the research that people do. I've seen that also practice. I mean, like in academia, some of us get promoted, and at some point with great power comes great responsibility. So we're heads of groups and we're managing people as well. And you see that even people like us that obsess about this, we also really, sometimes make mistakes as well, right? So the proposal I had was, yes, definitely let's do this conference again. But this time, I think there should be time for practitioners and academics to sit down around tables with real problems and with expertise in the table to start really thinking, what would you do in my organization based on the research we do? And I think that way, I can just be in your table, and I will say, it's great that you're introducing a diversity task force. What I will make sure is that that task force is a task that has force, right? That actually has the resources, has access to data, has access to information in order to identify what kind of processes might be biased, what kind of outcomes are reflecting that there is bias in the type of things that you do. And then from there, start really thinking about solutions and putting resources to solve the problem that kind of fits your culture and fits your structures, right? And that's the beauty of a task force, because you will be accountable, right, for making progress in your organization. And then your findings or the results of your study or your intervention will be transparent, and it will show that you're actually moving the needle, right?
Rudy.
I think we had we raised our hands.
Oh, please,
Go ahead.
I'm gonna, I think I agree with everything you said. It just, it's a couple of pragmatic things. If you should be thinking about how you're collecting data. So we were talking about the need for data, but at early stages, sometimes people aren't even thinking about what are the smart ways to capture and what am I trying to capture. Now, on the applicant side, that's a lot easier because you can use applicant tracking system, which makes work a lot easier for people who are doing recruiting. But there's a lot of other work that's going on where data is not being collected. So I think really, what a diversity committee can do is, and I'm assuming that there's part of your company that's data driven, is say, let's bring that in this context. So I think that's one thing that you can do that will only produce positive outcomes. It'll give you information that you can use. I think another thing is using that data eventually to assess things, to assess what's going on, because I think it sounds like you know something's wrong, but you don't know maybe why or where.
Sea level has all white men, we realize.
Yeah, that's not good.
The makeup of our entire company is about 50-50 in terms of gender.
Yeah.
And even on the minority side, we're not too bad, but we just realized once you get director or above, it just
Right. And then there's open questions as to whether or not that's happening because people are moving up or because of these lateral higher level hires, and you may not have the data to really answer that question yet. And then to the point of transparency, I would say being really crystal clear about what you are trying to do and communicative about process, and the data is going to help inform that. So I think those are I think the point is there's a lot of uncertainty. No one here can tell you what's going on in your organization, but I think that there's things you can do to start to answer those questions for yourself or collaborate with others to help answer those questions.
I have two really brief things. Are you getting paid for being on the diversity committee? Okay, that might be something that I would try to ask for or think about if that's real time that you're putting in that's not part of your job. And there are things that we have as individuals that we bring with us into work, and then there are things that work creates or a certain kind of thought it fosters. So both are important to think about, and both matter for organizational culture. You should try to think about ways to measure that in your context.
Let me say I've loved every one of the questions that I've heard you say today, and I think this one in particular is really interesting. Apologies to Emilio. I didn't mean to antagonize you in any way with a fourth worry thing. Because
I loved it.
Just because I actually really agree. The sort of the I think we want to be able to say what can we do with it without the mentality of like 6 hacks for creating diversity in your workplace kind of idea. I just want to reiterate that we have a lot of the same problems at Berkeley. What can I say? I don't know that it's worse, but there's all kinds of good trouble to go around, everywhere. And I deal with a little bit with a lot of that trouble. Some departments are ready for a much deeper dive. Other departments are really not. And the first task is let's collect some data, right? Let's just sort of what are different constituencies feeling and how is that affecting? It's a soft approach to start. So if there's one thing, it would be get paid and see if you can collect data. There's a great book. The edition I have is purple and yellow, and it's oldish, and it says, how to have influence when you're not in charge, which is like the story of my life. And a lot of this is about convincing people who are in the know, who might actually be able to have the ear of someone else. And you've also heard me speak about the having the need for people from the director level up recognize the importance of these things, and one of those people can be your champion. I'm sure.
You need a champion, though. You do.
So, but data is so important, and getting paid is too.
So I had a question. I feel like I heard a lot in this conference that there's a need for more research in actually implementing studies within companies, but at the same time, there's kind of a lot of risks associated with that for companies, and so there hasn't been very easy ways to create those partnerships. So I guess for someone who's within the industry, what is kind of the pitch that you can make for a company to engage in these types of studies?
Okay, go for it.
I'm doing this all the time, right? So yes, we're in the world where if we find things that are just that are problematic, you are at risk of having lots of issues, right? So when you collaborate with researchers, you can collaborate in an environment where there's a non-disclosure agreement. We will be confidential about, I will never put the name of your company in any of the papers that I'm actually really going to be writing. I will just be collecting data, collaborating with you, collecting data. And then from there also, then you are now at a point where if you find a problem and we work together in order to find a solution, which is like why I love to do interventions with companies, then now you're acting to solve a problem that it's there, and that actually can also provide you like a safe environment to act, right? It's if you don't act, or if you find that you're very reluctant to believe the results of those kind of findings, right? So that would be my way of pitching this. And I think that this is one of the things that I also wanted to come back to one of the previous panels today. If you're becoming the CDO or in a position of a high in the organization, you should be demanding to have the power to really be able to not only tackle the problem that you're facing, which is recruiting, performance evaluations, hiring, but also say, I want to do studies that are going to show me where I have problems and how the problems are changing. And if you're not supporting this type of internal studies, then you're not taking my role seriously, right? And I've seen my best studies is when the CDO of the company, right, says, this is going to happen because this is part of my responsibility, and you hire me to be in this kind of position, and I'm doing change in the workplace, but I also want to do like a type of research project to see if there is something else that we should be doing as well. And this it's a win-win situation as well, right? And it's part of being in a position where you have the power to also intervene and to collaborate on things that could be helpful to you.
Can I pick fact, there's also other things that we can do to, like, safeguards we can put in place. We often work with data, like, exclusively at that company's site, if that's a concern, and you can, like, companies can fully control the way that your organization gets described when we do talk about it. So it's not a completely separate process. You're very well integrated into how it then is presented in the future, which is one of the key concerns.
If I may, I do sense the beginning of the question and of that conversation is there's a lot of risks. How can we mitigate them? And again, I think that if there could be a framing that you can that you not necessarily you, but that people in this room who are working towards the common goal can approach, which is like, look, we need this for, like, there's a lot of benefits to being able to find out about issues that we may not even know about. There's I think the strategy of having a consultant come into the company, but there is power in numbers. There are organizations, and I think they're represented in this room, whose role is to address these issues, and so if there's a way in which the company can be one of many. Yeah. And there's a way to work that out, and I just want to echo what you say, which is that the companies have a lot of say about, like, this is the conditions under which we give data, right? We do this all the time with very sensitive, even HIPAA type of data, where there is a way to not identify participants, but there's a power there, and we will crack that particular nut, I think, if we can get 2 or 3 companies that lead the charge in that space of collaboration towards inclusion, that's not just them. And that may be too hopeful, but
good story.
Can I say one more thing that I was thinking when you were responding to is, it's also like about finding a place where we can meet. That doesn't necessarily have to make you uncomfortable giving all the data and all access, and some of us may not do that kind of research where you build barriers and you say, no, we're not going to give you compensation, or we're not going to give you that, right? But it's still like we can come to a common ground where we can go and do training sessions where some of your managers are randomly assigned to different conditions, right? And we're able to see what the impact of being in one intervention versus another might have in the way they're actually making decisions in the workplace. And when we write the research paper, we don't have to really say what the name of the company is, and it can go in through the protocol, the research protocol, without necessarily. So there are different forms of also doing research that could be comfortable to the organization that you're working with, right? So it's not about giving all the data.
Okay, I want to call on Jez up here and then swimming right here. Yeah.
So I just want to share my personal story around gathering data, which is that I was involved in and there's a lot of tech companies with marketing departments with large budgets to do surveys to produce bullshit marketing reports.
Yes.
And my personal story as to why I've got a data set of more than 20,000 responses from companies worldwide is that a researcher attended a talk where we were talking about it and said, you're doing this all wrong, your survey design's horrible, your analysis is rubbish. And we were like, you should come to our next meeting. And she basically fixed all the stuff for this company, but also put a whole bunch of questions into the surveys, which means we're now validating the research that I talked about yesterday by Sarah Jane Leslie in the tech industry, and talking about identity and inclusion as part of those surveys. So I just want to offer that up as a way of getting data. As part of those surveys, you ask a bunch of demographic questions. What's the size of the company? What's the sector? We asked percentage of women. We had a question this year. We asked about racial makeup, and you can ask a bunch of these questions. And people will be happy to do this. They want to produce marketing surveys that aren't bullshit. Yeah. So you can help them get better. You can get a whole bunch of data that you want. All these tech companies have marketing departments with huge amounts of money. Yes.
We'll follow them. Follow the money. Follow the money.
I'm happy to talk to anyone who's interested to talk to me about this.
Great.
I'll say something. genuinely, I get that many events in my inbox. And so I'm telling you that there's been this spin out of events, and I think there's a really high variance on quality, and this is something that I said to a lot of people, is as a CDO who's really trying to push the envelope on data, I really struggle to sit in a room and learn from people, and that's been completely not the experience I've had over the last day and a half. Like, I literally juggled my whole schedule today so I could sit here and just listen to everyone.
Yay.
And so I'm saying that, like, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Like, this is so interesting, and I need to go rethink, like, everything I'm doing in my life. But I would also encourage to think about when you're redoing this is be really aggressive about marketing, and especially word of mouth marketing for people that have been here.
Okay.
Like, lean on people who have reputations, and also think about trying to work with an organization who already has a good reputation. So they're like tech inclusion, really great group, but not super academic. And so like adding a day onto their conference that's like the research day or like the consortium day, like there are things that you can do there that I think would drive attendance because there's so much value for things like this. And a lot of inclusion events are not this content rich. And there's a huge audience for people who want this. It's really a marketing problem. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very helpful.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I was just loud.
Okay, hi. I have one offering in the sort of like, how could it be better?
Yeah.
I've worked in Silicon Valley designing and facilitating interactive events, also known as unconferences, specifically with professional and scientific communities. And I think like the what you were talking about, sitting at the tables, like how do you figure out how all that mingling happens in a way that meets people's needs? And I'd be really thrilled if you were interested in some portion of the next event being an unconference that was really like saying like, get the chief diversity officers culture, whatever, from Silicon Valley, and half of them and half a room full of research, and you'll have an amazing conversation for an afternoon.
Cool.
That will just be totally different than the one-to-many format that so many of the events that she's talking about are. And something I have.
And we'll come with the non-disclosure agreements and the computers to download the data, right?
Yeah, but it starts the conversations, right?
Yes,
and
of
you
course.
probably put it under Chatham House rules and figure out how you share some of it and not all of it.
Of course.
But something I haven't heard today, and that I keep surfacing when I'm watching this conversation happening in industry, is about disability. And a huge number of the population in these tech companies is on the has Asperger's, is on autism spectrum. It's not being talked about, and it's affecting how those populations are interacting with these issues and the capacities they have, and it's just not even. I didn't hear the word once. I was only here today. Maybe it came up yesterday, but I think it really needs to be thought about.
It's a really important comment. It's a tough issue, but thank you for sharing that. I mean, we're talking about how we have to talk about tough issues, race, class. That is definitely out there in this particular population.
Yeah, well, just to add to that, I think that's also a space where there's huge data challenges because on the applicant side, sometimes companies ask, but a lot of people don't disclose for good reasons. I don't know, I think it's very difficult for someone to say, what is the percentage of employees with disabilities who disclose once they're in a company, but I think there's probably going to be some difference between the amount of people who are there and the amount of people who tell you that they're there. So I think that's part of the reason that hasn't come up, which is unfortunate, but because the reason to not give that information makes total sense, but it makes it hard to really learn about those challenges.
Can I just piggyback to the same point? Sexuality in the workplace is hard to study for the same data.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we sort of touched on it a little bit, yeah.
Thank you for doing this conference, and everyone who participated. It's wonderful. I want to say a couple things that are a little bit intense. So one is that we've been very, very polite about what's happening in industry right now. It's ugly and it's painful. And I've been in IT all of my career, over 20 years, and I've seen some gnarly, terrible stuff. And when I was coming up, I didn't know what to look for. And I don't think a lot of people know what to look for. I don't think they know, like, when your supervisor says, no, I'm not giving him a better project over you, I just think he's better suited, that's discrimination. So I didn't know that when I was 22. I started to think it when I was 28. When I was in my 30s, I know what's going on now. But I don't think a lot of people know what to look for. And I think if we can incorporate some of the knowledge around have you heard this? Have you seen this? What do you need to, what do you do? What power do you have to take it to where it needs to go? Maybe your supervisor's ignoring it, so you need to go to HR. Maybe HR is crooked. Then do you go to diversity? Diversity might not have power. Right. So we have to talk about that stuff here, and we have to get the people who may not know what the triggers are, they may not know what the characteristics are in this room, so they're prepared. Yeah. Because I'm not done, and I have a long time to go in my career, and I know what to look for now, and I know how to push back, and I know how to document, and I know how to surface it with the right people, but I didn't know that 10 years ago. So where would I be in my career if I knew how to deal with that? Yeah. And it's big right now, and I hope it's not a trend. I hope that talking about diversity isn't just a buzzword. But I'm grateful to be here, and I'm invigorated. And when women come to me and say, I think I'm going to leave tech. I just don't think it's right for me. And I'm on a team where I'm producing and I'm just not being recognized, and they don't have anywhere to go. I tell them what I did, but they don't feel empowered. Women and minorities, I don't think feel empowered, and that should be one of the big themes here.
Yeah, how can we empower them? Yeah.
I think I want to take what you said, and it's no question that it's intense, and there's a lot of gnarly stuff going on. But boy, am I grateful that there are people who can come to you, and that's how cultural change, begins to be instilled. The hopeful thing I hear is that you've got a long way to go, and that you're not planning to leave, and that you're interrupting that process through which exit leads to even less entry and retention. So one of the things that we can do is take care of those masters of knowledge who have the skill and the resources and the wherewithal to advise others. It's a fantastically deep organizational challenge because there's a lot of resistance, but I think I just want to recognize that individually you also have this really, you have such a big impact.
And your mentorship could make a huge difference for that generation coming up. And it would probably make you feel better too. I'm one of maybe, I don't know, how many women deans are there on this campus? Not enough. Maybe 5 of us. So, out of 25, 20%. Faculty, I don't know how many faculty, what's the percentage of women faculty on this campus?
Faculty is at about, I think, 40.
40, yeah. So we should have more women deans.
Although, but there's
depends on the field.
Yeah, exactly. you look at, science and tech versus,
the parts of campus.
North-south.
North-south, we have, but.
Director and above, kind of,
Yeah. But I'm sure you know this. The lunches I have with the other women deans is something I look forward to every month. So finding community. The old boys perpetuate themselves by networking, and we can do it too.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to keep jumping in, but there's the issue of the recognition that you deserve as an agent of change and support for individuals. But that's why, you know, the interest groups. What are they called? REGEs? I'm sorry, the ERG groups. But again, those need to have funding, and someone needs to make that decision to give them funding and to be recognized and celebrated as part of the, you know, as part of the organization. But there's always sort of I think of prejudice as you know, when I think of prejudice, I always say it's like this blob, right? And you go, and then it goes, you know, and then you go, you know. So one of the things that happens, for example, is that you give. Let's say that you say, okay, fine, we will give your ERG, you know, $20,000, and you go do your work. Suddenly, I am moral, I'm good. This is the moral licensing effect that, you know, and what happens next is you feel completely licensed and morally justified to make whatever promotion or hiring or firing decision that you want, which is then subject to bias. So you know, we're in the struggle, and I mean that in the deepest historical sense.
And the fact that I think it's an opening. The fact that it is ugly right now in Silicon Valley, it is. It has been for a long time, but finally it's coming to the surface. I mean, this has been going on for decades, and we're talking about it, and it is going to take decades, I am sure. But it's great we're talking about it. Yeah, here. Mic people? Or runners? Yeah.
Hi, so I'm a first-year graduate student at the high school, and I just want to say this is a fantastic program and event, and I'm really happy to be here, and I hope next year I'll see more of my classmates here as well. So that brings me to my question. Should graduate programs that are training the future leaders in tech be required to provide training for their students and or equip them with the knowledge and encouragement to advocate for diversity and inclusion before the students go into the workplace?
I think there's an overwhelming yes in this panel. Maybe. You don't think? How do we equip them? That's a harder question.
No, I actually think who should be doing that is like the harder institutional question to figure out. Like, whose responsibility is it to provide that training, and then how do you enforce that people are required? Like, how do you think about whether or not you should make it mandatory, and what are the consequences for that? But yes, obviously, I think the answer is yes. I think it's a tricky problem, and like grad student government has often ended up weird groups have ended up taking on that role because your actual department has probably abstained.
Hey, we're gonna get into it.
But Frank Dobbin's research at Harvard suggests that diversity training doesn't work.
No.
But that's different.
You're baiting me. No, it's cool.
No, but just a minute. She's asking, should we, not diversity training, but how should we teach them to advocate for themselves?
Yeah, you know, it's a class, and, you know, like,
classes
you
come
know,
and go.
moral licensing, you know.
Well, probably the students won't want to take it.
Well, just a point. It seems like you're both asking two different questions, sort of around the same coin, which is what do I do as a professional moving through the world, and how do I handle what could be like a hostile environment, and then you're asking from I'm a leader, what can I do? I think those are tricky questions. I think part of the reason that we're maybe not giving the answers that you would want is because there's a lot of people who are very cautious about what we know and what we don't know, and I think that can be sometimes disappointing. But I think to your point, I think that, or to your question, I think that because there are people speaking up, you just said you didn't know what to look for. I think there's a lot of people communicating online in different ways, and I think that's great. I think it's a little scary too, because some people may see that and say, oh no, and that's something that I think we're worried about as people are trying to get women and people of color into tech. I think to answer your question, I think that a lot of people on this panel are really interested in structures and how structures can change, and I think teaching people how to think about what structures are or what policies and practices are more subject to bias. So we were talking earlier, Steve was talking about sort of shifting criteria, and like I think there are some basic things you can think about, like just making sure that rubrics are very clear around how you're evaluating people, both in terms of hiring and performance, and even on the more like fuzzy topics like how do you assign projects. I think data can help you sort of be self-critical, and I also think I think like putting more sort of on process that is and structure that may not be fun, but will ultimately help you make better decisions is part of the way to go. But I think you should be learning these things.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
That your answer made me think of. You should also, like in terms of navigating grad school, ask your professors, and you may not always get answers that you like. Like if you would like the classroom to be more inclusive, or you notice shifts that could enhance your learning experience, you should feel empowered to ask your professor to do those things. They might not always agree, but that's part of their job, is to just listen to your question. And an example of that is like when I was in first year, I had a very hard time talking in class, and I asked a professor to invite me to speak. And it was a weird thing, and it was hard, but that really helped. And that was one version of how I tried to negotiate with my environment in the classroom to make it work for me. So maybe that might work for you.
Longer conversation, to be sure. Okay, we have one back there, one there, and then we'll see if we have a third one, and then I think we're going to have to run out of time.
Hi.
But yes.
Hi, I just wanted to jump on that one also as a professor of information studies and someone who teaches students like you in LIS management. I think, first of all, thank you for raising the issue as a student, because you have incredible power as a student within the university environment to ask for the kinds of skills and knowledge that are valuable to you. So one thing that we find ourselves doing at a school that shall not be named where I work is constantly trying to ask the students to advocate so that we as faculty can demonstrate that our students are seeking the kind of knowledge that you're talking about, and so that we can make that case in our curriculum, and that it come out just from the compartmentalization of 1 week about diversity and challenges, and actually be integrated in a meaningful way in the curriculum. And the other thing I wanted to say about that to you as a student, but also as a future professional, I presume, is that when you leave school, you will be taking that expectation into the workplace that others have those same kind of skills that you yourself are asking for. And that is where the kind of sea change I will hope to see will come from, through your process of being involved in hiring and retention and putting those skills on the table. When we were talking again about measuring applicants, do they have demonstrable skills around issues of equity and inclusion? Could they talk about what those things are in their interview? To pick on James Damore one more time, one of the big failings of his manifesto was that it was simply factually inaccurate and wrong, because he didn't have the requisite knowledge in social sciences and history to speak about it, and yet he felt empowered to. But what would it look like if when you're a leader and you're hiring, actually hire people who have those skills demonstrated and don't just riff and bring the company down? So thanks for bringing it up, and as a professor, I'm going to try to give that to all of you.
Okay. You had a question or comment?
Yeah, I wanted to affirm your question that you asked, because I think it has implications with respect to a term. I'm speaking as a fellow researcher. I think your question has implications with respect to a term we use in research called indicators. And I've been listening for the last couple of days, and what I've arrived at the conclusion of, and even based on the question you asked, is that there is an opportunity. There's an opportunity to produce data that helps to establish indicators for diversity and inclusion. Yeah. The reason why I'm speaking like that is because I'm currently a part of a project right now where we're looking at STEM indicators and how those indicators have implications with respect to policy and practice, curriculum development and instruction in the K-12 environment. But if we flip it in the workforce area, in tech, you can think of the role and the value of indicators with respect to diversity and inclusion as it relates to industry level metrics. So your question is revealing that there's an opportunity for this work. It's also putting a charge to us as researchers to begin to embark on this work, because there's not a lot of information out there about that. But it's needed. How do we know? Because your question is valuable. It's valid. And we ought to be able to answer that question for the next generation that's preparing to enter the workforce. And if we cannot answer it, it's not a criticism to us. It means that we got to get on the ball and move in that direction. Because the degree to which we approach that has implications for your future. Okay? So just affirming your question.
Thank you for that. I do think that companies are starting to be embarrassed into providing data, but it's not great, and we could do a lot better, and maybe we get a consortium of companies to agree to give us their data. And I think there are many things that we ought to be thinking about moving forward. We have time for one last comment or point. Yes, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for putting this conference together. I think it was the right schedule and the right number of participants from the right areas, both industry and academia, removing the silos that keep us separated. Certainly the right topic at the right time. And so I hope that you do consider doing this again in the future. And we will bring friends, and we will bring people from industry, and
that's what we need.
All that. But the comment or the observation that I've been making over the last couple of days, and I think that there's some opportunity for future research and perhaps also different types of people, speakers on panels, would be to look at the sustainability movement as an example of something that went from forced compliance to all the way to enthusiastic adoption by both research and by industry. And I think that there are many lessons to be learned from sustainability as a topic and as kind of a learning curve that we all had to take. And I just think I want to just close with that positive example of where something has worked in our
thank you.
favor.
Thank you so much for that. It is true. We have made progress on sustainability, even if there are climate change deniers out there. We have made, in companies, we've made real progress, and that is a good model. So thank you for that. Thank you so much to each of our panel members for really all your wonderful comments. Thank you for the audience.